being here tonight for such an important analysis. The removal of Maduro at the beginning of January by the US military and special forces has generated a lot of questions, some hope, while still leaving many question marks. The implication of this action from the perspective of international law and the respect of national sovereignty should be viewed in the perspective of the extent to which Maduro enjoyed a legitimacy, him and his regime. And also from the point of view of what kind of capacity there is there in Venezuela for a new democratic leadership, and we're thinking here of Machado, to take over, in spite of the remaining control by key figures of the Maduro regime, first and foremost by President Rodriguez. These are only some questions related to the power vacuum in Venezuela. What will be really the change that will take place in this country is hard to know, and I'm sure tonight we will learn something more about this. But the events of Venezuela also raise more general geopolitical questions. First of all, the impact of this action on the rivalry between the US and China, and in a more indirect way with Iran. Neil Ferguson has recently analyzed the military action as a move to deprive China of precious oil in light of what he considers, using, by the way, the power transition theory of Karol Gansky, what he considers a growing trend towards something that might end up being a war between the United States and China. And also, we should ask ourselves, what is the replicability of this type of actions in other areas of the world, be it Iran, Greenland, as we know, this is quite timely. But also, the renewal of the Monroe Doctrine and the so-called Roosevelt corollary, which has now been translated into the Trump corollary. And last but not least, the emergence of a new approach to strategic use of power, which after October 7th and the war in the Middle East is shifting the focus to the elimination of the proxies rather than taking head-on the superpower in conflict. And this is quite interesting. For instance, if we look at what Kennedy did with Cuba, maybe Trump had been there in Cuba, would have just gotten rid of Cuba rather than quarrel with Russia. These are all very interesting and also very difficult issues to disentangle. And I'm sure that tonight we will have a great opportunity to do so. So I thank you all for being here, and I now give the floor to the director of the Guarini Center, Federico. Thank you all.
Thank you, President. Good evening. We're going to proceed in the following way. All four of us will take 15 minutes of your time, and then there will be hopefully enough room for Q's and A's. So prepare your questions and answers while we talk. And I will force myself to stay within it's 7:07 now. So I go until 7:22 maximum. What are the precedents of the action against Maduro, if any? I have a number of answers, and I will list them rather briefly. Some more descriptively, some others just by mentioning them. I think one precedent, in a certain sense, is the fall of Mussolini in Italy in July 1943. It's not exactly the same pattern, but there are similarities. There was an Allied invasion of Italy that did not touch Rome, but until much later, but that caused the collapse of the regime. Basically, the chronology shortly is landing in Sicily on July 10th, bombing of Rome, a carpet bombing of an entire district in Rome, San Lorenzo, on the 19th of July, made famous by the visit of Pope Pius XII, who rushed to the district to sort of empathize with the unfortunate population. The bombing claimed 1,200 casualties. And then 6 days later, an almost dead body that was supposed to advise the leader of fascism was sort of brought back to life, the Grand Council, and decided to recommend to the king that Mussolini be dismissed. So it was kind of in a slow motion and with different scenarios. It was more or less the same thing that happened in Venezuela, sort of, especially with regards to popular jubilation at the news that the regime had ended. There has been popular jubilation. I don't know if it continues today. Venezuela has unfortunately disappeared from the radars, as if things that happen there are no longer relevant, while they are extremely relevant. But that's how the media work. Attention has shifted elsewhere. Greenland, Iran, and others. Yet, I think this is certainly, even though a little forced, one of the precedents of the removal of a tyrant who is increasingly unpopular in his own country and whose legitimacy is strongly questioned. Let's not forget that Maduro basically was manipulating the election. His last two elections were grossly falsified, thanks to a combination of multiple ballots, violence, intimidation, and so on. So he was turning totally illegitimate, and there has been very little, if any, resistance to his removal, in spite of the fact that it also caused casualties. 32 Cuban Praetorians allegedly died, and they are celebrated as great heroes of the anti-Yankee war, the eternal rhetoric of the anti-Yankee war in Cuba. And that's the most ancient precedent. Another precedent that I think is worth examining is the removal of Noriega from Panama. Noriega was a president, but the president in quotes, of the state of Panama. You probably know that Panama is a state entirely created by a US intervention in the early years of the 20th century. And Panama was created precisely over the dispute about building a canal. The story is kind of interesting. Suez was built in the 1860s, and it revolutionized international commerce, of course, because it finally made ships, made it possible for ships to avoid the circumnavigation of Africa. The Vasco da Gama route which was too long and not very economic. So cutting the Suez Canal was sensational. We also know that Verdi celebrated with Aida that exceptional feat, exceptional also for Egypt, etc. This gave the impulse to Americans at large, North and South, to cut a canal precisely in the region. It was then a region of Colombia, the northern region of Colombia, Panama, which is where the two oceans are not east and west, but north and south, and the land is very thin. There is a short distance, I think less than 200 miles from one ocean to the other. But in Colombia, there was a big discussion, an internal discussion. We do it as I wish. No, we do it as parliament. No, we do as the cacique here and there once, etc. There was no way to solve the problem until the US, thanks also to the corollary, the Roosevelt corollary previously mentioned of the Monroe Doctrine, decided to intervene and basically promoted the secession of Panama from Colombia, which was successful because of the promise by the US to share the profits with a new state, and the canal was built within a couple of years and inaugurated in the latest years of the Roosevelt presidency. Then a jump to the 1980s. In the 1980s, Noriega, who was not really a president, he was basically born of a dictator of Panama, because the elected president had died in a mysterious air crash. The real president was called Torrijos. So Noriega was the hub. His power was a hub for very obscure traffics. Traffic in various types of drugs, and then the Iran-Contra outrage that had affected the Reagan presidency. And he had accumulated excessive power and had probably largely overstepped his role. So the Bush senior administration in late 1989 decided it was high time to remove him from office. So an American force invaded Panama, finding almost no opposition. He was arrested, Noriega was arrested, brought, taken to Miami, if I remember correctly, and put on trial and imprisoned for a certain period of time, after which he was allowed to return home and sort of live his last years in Panama, when in Panama an almost normal democratic process was reinstated. So the Bush senior administration managed more or less to remove a dictator that was certainly successful and replace him with a reasonable democratic process, more or less. The third and last example, it's two examples actually, that I would like to mention, are regime changes in two Arab states, Iraq 2003 and Libya 2011. Because these two regime changes have produced long-lasting consequences and not really positive. Iraq 2003 was an operation that tried desperately to gain legitimacy from the UN first, and then even from NATO, even though NATO had nothing to do with the Middle East. Yet, NATO had already been called to action in an out-of-area mission following 9/11, and the fact that after 9/11, Article 5 of NATO, of the North Atlantic Treaty, was enacted, which says that an attack on one member is an attack on the entire organization. So NATO took care, with the UN endorsement, of the counter-offensive against the terrorist attacks of 9/11. So the out-of-area taboo, sort of, had already been violated, and therefore trying to call NATO in action in Iraq made certain sense, but it failed. There was a complete stalemate in the UN Security Council, with France and Russia opposing any action against Saddam Hussein. And then there was a very, very tiny quasi-majority among the NATO members. So it was at that time that the term, which has become popular recently again, coalition of the willing. The term coalition of the willing was inaugurated precisely to indicate those who were willing to act to remove Saddam Hussein from office for blatant violations of various agreements after the First Gulf War and other reasons. The removal happened in March of 2003 and was successful. It happened through a rapid invasion of Iraq, and Saddam Hussein went in hiding, but he abandoned power, and then he was found at the end of that year by Iraqis, by the Iraqi police force, and sentenced to death and executed by the rival Shiite factions. After that came a period which I will deal with, which was the attempt at building a democracy in Iraq, like forcibly upon the reluctant Iraqi population. Last but not least, Gaddafi. Gaddafi was a dictator in Libya, and his removal happened mostly because of a French impulse. The French admittedly wanted to get rid of Gaddafi, not because he was a tyrant that oppressed his population, that was the disguise of the operation, but because he annoyed the French in their African policy. And therefore his removal was absolutely necessary from the French neo-colonial project point of view. And it happened. It happened, and the French were good enough, admittedly, I repeat, admittedly today, they were good enough to disguise the entire operation as a humanitarian operation aimed at promoting democracy, aiming at making Libya part of the so-called Arab Spring, etc., etc. Yet, the tyrant Gaddafi, who was like a moderate tyrant compared to various others, was literally executed in the street by French agents with no trial, with no previous discussion, just a murder in the street. And that event has affected definitely East-West relations, because Russia also fell in the trap, believe it or not, Putin's Russia, in the trap to the point that at the UN they voted in favor of making Libya a no-fly zone, which was then quickly and sort of skillfully transformed into a regime change operation. Many details would be necessary, but I'm running out of time, so I will conclude here. What are the perspectives of the regime change in Venezuela, and has there been a regime change, by the way? Or is it a Chavismo, Madurismo without Chavez and without Maduro? It's too early to say. It's too early to say, but the On the good side, there's the fact that Venezuela is one of the Latin American states with the best democratic tradition, or if you prefer, the least worst democratic tradition. It survived the Cold War without falling into the Cold War trap that in Latin America consists of a revolutionary left and a reactionary right that clash with one another and produce damage for the country. That was avoided from the late 50s to the late 80s, and that is certainly a great merit. After that, Chavez came into power, then Maduro, and the situation tended to degenerate. So it's too early to say. It's an interesting experiment. I don't know how the United States will be able to take care, as promised by President Trump, of the return of democracy in Venezuela. I have no idea. We will see. We will have to be patient and see. Thank you very much. And I now pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Cole.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Indeed, I'm simultaneous, so I'm associate professor here at John Cabot University, and I have to say that our program in international affairs, including at the graduate level, is tremendously popular. And it seems that international politics, being on every news and every agenda, is really something that I feel that this university and more collectively us as a community need to make, let's say, really take seriously, okay? Because I really think that collective thinking beyond the headlines is going to be tremendously important for the very stormy years ahead. And I would say that we've been discussing already for a year the end, perhaps transformational end of the liberal international order, but 2026 seemed to me that we are looking at something at the end of international order. Because there's one thing that order connotes is regularized practices of exchange among units that recognize each other. Now we have a very, very unpredictable situation, and that is also, let's say, a responsibility for the analysts. Right? We need to not only just follow the headlines, because that blitz diplomacy and what is going on right now is potentially going to consume us so much that we forget what happened only a few weeks ago. So I'm very thankful to be on this panel, and what I would like to do is to sort of take a little bit of a step back and try to outline a few, let's say, thinking about interventions as in ideal types, okay? And I'm going to sort of sketch out three different kinds or types of late modern interventions. And I'm doing this also because I'd like us to question a little bit peace, the concept of peace and peace practices, because interventions in the end are methods, I think, to pursue certain visions of peace. Okay, and I'm saying this also partially because it happens to be that I'm Norwegian, and we are currently in a little bit of a situation there, Trump's latest message was, considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace. Now, I'm not going to analyze that tremendously, but I think this is there's an invitation here to think about interventions, indeed beyond the sort of latest foreign policy acrobatics, and also to, let's say, de-reify peace, okay? I don't think there's enough, we have to accept that it's extremely political, and there's nothing really timeless or benevolent necessarily even about it. So, a political, sciencey approach to peace and intervention. So what I'm going to do in this is to kind of sketch out these three different forms. I'm open to questions about whether they make sense and how the latest, indeed, capture of a state leader in Venezuela fits into this, right? These are ideal types. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive. Indeed, I think that they exist alongside each other. But we might see a bit of a paradigm shift towards a sort of third one that I'm going to sketch out. And it has to do with the sort of the theory of change behind but it also very much has to do with the modes, the objectives, and the relations, the relationships that these sort of types of intervention envisions. So the first one I would call sort of reconstruction, and this is a well-known term, and indeed I think this sort of denotes a comprehensive and quite sort of institutionalized mode of state building, oriented towards a fairly universalist model of social order. Typically they were articulated in quite normative terms, such as democratic peace or liberal democratic peace, something in that kind of direction. Very structured around hierarchical donor-recipient relations. The 1990s laid this out. It sort of peaked, I think, with interventions in Iraq, in Afghanistan first, and then Iraq. And the mode here is indeed comprehensive. It's both deep and it's broad, and it's focused on institutions, right? These are the engines of change, and the investments, coming through interventions, will sort of, be focused on and geared towards their reform. So institutional reform became, really important. And I would say that we have elements of reconstruction forms of intervention still, laying about, as it were, or being active. It is not necessarily the most dominant form. The objectives in this sort of reconstruction type, I would say, is the state, right? The state is the object of desire. The change is laying at the state's propensity, however, for providing better domestic contexts. Of course, there are bigger theories for what that domestic change will do to the overarching international landscape, but it is essentially their, domestic focused. And so indeed, in that sort of paradigm, weak states were the problem. They could be hijacked. So, you better be there and build these strong states. The relationships in that sort of paradigm, or that type, is indeed very sort of hierarchical. The external local dimension is upheld and ratified, and the local, in this position, is seen as capable of change. However, only with the supervision by an external donor or mentor. Okay, so ideal type 1. Ideal type 2, which I think we have indeed seen the West has sort of practiced this in lots of intervention theaters, is centered around the concept of resilience. Now, interestingly, in Europe, as we have awoken to this turn to territorial defense, is that resilience has come home. So it has been experimented in intervention theaters and has now come home, with some translation challenges. Now, resilience operates in quite a different way. So it's really through the preservation and the strengthening of societies, right? Societies' capabilities to withstand pressures despite the lack of strong and capable institutions. And it's through resilience as sort of the particular and the extraordinary of societies emerge as the locus of intervention. And there's all kinds of, wonderful reasons why, intervention could rely on resilience as a sort of vision rather than reconstruction, right? You de-responsibilize institutions, and the state becomes much more, desirable or object of intervention, which of course is very, building strong state and strong institutions is very labor intensive. Now, the modes in this resilience paradigm, or I will say ideal type, is a sort of the band-aid approach, right? So it's really how to avoid a full breakdown of societies by strengthening the capacity to withstand pressure and stress, and how enable societies to be creative in managing very much through informal mechanisms. Also, there's a sort of an idea of a baseline security. That security is not necessarily, sought through reform of state institutions or security providers. Rather, they would training and advising and equipping certain units, perhaps to perform a certain level of sovereignty without necessarily becoming strong states. The objectives here, indeed, is that, well, the state is not really the problem, but it's also not really the solution. So the state has, in the resilience, I would say, kind of type or vision, really not been very much considered. And rather, it's really focused on societies and also some of the transnational, let's say, elements of society, such as the economy, diaspora support, thinking about migration and so on. The relationships or relations, I would say, is also quite different. They have rather followed a sort of flatter structure, if you like. The donors facilitate sort of resilient support, but the aim here is then to, shape certain futures. And indeed, I think sort of absorption of migration, informal welfare networks, and so on. If you look into sort of the details of those activities mounted under a resilience heading, they will have these kind of elements without necessarily building strong leadership. These are quite leaderless. You don't need that, right? It's decentered and flat in that sense. Okay, so here we go with the third one, and it's a proposition. I do think it speaks to somewhat, Professor Gentieri was saying before. And I would call it sort of a recovery, but perhaps we could call it an infrastructural form of interventionism, if you like. Now, I think there's a distinct terrain here that we need to identify, and which I think we see, frankly, on sort of steroids under the second Trump administration. Here, recovery, and I use this term because it's used a lot in Ukraine, okay? And I think that this indeed is not something which has started with the Trump administration. I think there is a broader practice that we can identify here, however. And indeed, I think that there is something key which is around the recovery agenda in Ukraine, which we can also indeed build up to be a stronger theoretical construct here. Because first of all, I would probably argue that it's sort of restorative. So recovery, it's about re-establishing perceived previous levels of functionality or a certain past. Okay, but it's primarily, of course, certainly geostrategic, and it's explicitly framed in those ways, right? Anchoring political entities, such as Ukraine, but indeed, the Venezuela case indeed fits really well here, let's say, within a particular spatial and political life world. But I wonder if it's also, to some extent, civilizational, and we can discuss it. But invoking a return to or a continuation of some historically grounded identities and trajectories. This is also a form, I would say, of owning time. So recovery, or maybe infrastructuralism, really entails both a temporal project of collective sense-making, but also a spatial material effort to embed the intervention site with a preferred future. So it's really actively shaping, the future. And let me just very quickly say that I think, the modes here is about connecting the place of intervention to geostrategic spaces via physical, financial, and also semiotic infrastructures. Okay, so it's really about that the state is back, but the state is a facilitator of these infrastructural connections, right? And this is tremendously important. It's also, it seems to me, sort of the MO, let's say, is about betting on a strong leader. And you see this in Syria, for example. There is no comprehensive state building sponsored by anyone, really. There are lots of external donors interested in getting their foot inside and shaping certain directions. There is no, there's definitely, say, the betting on a strong leader that can facilitate this. The objectives here, I would indeed argue, and I think this is coherent with sort of consensus, is about preventing global contenders' infrastructurality. So the other, competitors in the system, and repelling attacks on the core. So building peripheries, however, that is not, these are localized peripheries, right? The relations here are then, the subjectivities change to partners. Okay, you can have that, with partners, with states in this new geostrategic paradigm, where indeed recipients are sort of frontline warriors, donors are building deterrence, and the infrastructures are somehow agents in this spiel of relational consolidation. And maybe that was a little overkill. I hope to animate some discussion. I feel that my reading of Venezuela, and unfortunately also a little bit, many of us quickly following the recent diplomacy around Greenland, and who knows what comes next, this kind of indeed blitz diplomacy by the White House. There is some elements that fits here in this sort of recovery infrastructural ideal type, where indeed who gets to be the leader? It's to be determined by the externals, right? Betting on that who can facilitate the extractive or the extraction really of the wealth of this country, and indeed linking this relationally to this hemispheric discourse speaks very much to a sort of consolidation, I think, of this type. Will there be a paradigm shift whereby reconstruction and resilience will go away? Not necessarily, I think, at least for the time being, but that is really much to be determined. Thank you.
Thank you. Norwegian punctuality. Professor Alleggi, American, Italian punctuality, whatever you prefer, but punctuality.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. First time I speak here, so I'm a bit nervous. I don't know my audience. Usually in other places, I know exactly who's sitting in front and know what jokes to make. So, and I'll take this as rehearsing tomorrow because I'm giving an hour-long class to the Italian Higher Defense Institute next door on exactly the same subject. So I'll use you as a sounding board to test my ideas. Now, of course, it's not easy to come here speaking for the bad guys. It's, however, what increasingly frequently the case when one has to interpret current US affairs. I would have much rather have discussed the bombing of Rome on my birthday 20 years earlier, but you can't always have what you want. I always tell people, you'll know when I'm born. Everybody remembers in the world when I was born. So, I think that what we're trying to do, what we're faced with, is trying to understand what is going on. It's not so much the evident attack on, let's say, the international order, or to put it even more simply, on the world as we knew it. I think it's sort of pre-legal structure. It's things being the way they're supposed to be, things we grew up with. That is patently happening. What we're trying and struggling, I would add, to understand is why, is whether there is a plan or not. Because if there is, it seems to be very well hidden. Now the question is whether it's hidden because it exists and we don't want to show it, or because we have to sort of find some regularity in what is going on. There's so many things going on that I think that there's too many variables to be certain of what is happening. In fact, I think that there's so many things going on that whatever the design is, it's not going to work. My theory is that there's only so much political capital which anyone has available, and it has to be used, let's say, judiciously if you want to achieve anything. And I think that there's just too many things going on. Even if we take out of the equation, let's say, specific, circumscribed interventions, dropping a few bombs on Iran, shooting a few cruise missiles into Nigeria. Take that out of the equation, but trying to redefine somehow Eastern Europe with Ukraine, trying to redesign the Middle East, trying to redesign the Arctic, and now the latest thing is replacing the UN with a golf club. And I say that because in many ways, it's much less fascinating than the beautiful theoretical models which Silvia explained to us. I think that we cannot discount the mental models of Donald Trump, which are basically real estate and golf clubs. And I think that his limitations, his mental limitations, in terms of imagination, we're not going to go into his cognitive tests, but his limitations there, we all try to do that to some extent, to compare new situations to the ones we know. And we use those to frame our answer. And so one is real estate, it's own and build and rent, and works with own Greenland, it works with rebuild Gaza and turn it into Miami or whatever. That's one model. The other thing is the Board of Peace, where you pay $1 billion for permanent membership, but the owner, who's Donald, calls the shots. It's not very different from a golf club. You pay into a membership, but the guy who owns the club is actually running the show. And I think it's much less fascinating and much less intellectually stimulating than these beautiful structural models, but I'm afraid that it's more directly applicable. Now, the problem is that the owner of the golf club is trying to shoot too many holes at the same time, and I think that one of the balls is going to come back and hit him, which would actually be good. The problem is some of these random balls end up hitting the audience, in which case it's much less pleasant. In other words, in the first Trump administration, the big word was disruption. This idea that by reshuffling situations, America would, the United States, sorry, would come up somehow on top, which is interesting. Now we're not even mentioning disruption anymore, but I think that the limitation is that when you start dismantling structures in a big way, you don't know literally which way the chips are going to fall. There might be some other actor who manages to see and make order out of chaos. So I think that that is a very risky proposition. In that way, Venezuela looks much better than Greenland. Venezuela, leaving aside international law, leaving aside moral issues, was a bloody, well-executed show. It's too bad for the 100 victims between Venezuelans and Cubans, but anyone trying to extract someone from, starting from ships 600 or 700 miles out at sea, going with helicopters, and actually getting your targets out alive without any problem, any significant problem, is quite a technical achievement. Of course, we know that, you know, the old Italian joke, I'll say it in Italian, l'operazione riuscita, il paziente morto. The procedure was successful, but the patient died, right? So we still don't know that, but the procedure was extremely successful. And what's left of the, let's say, US foreign policy and security establishment seems to have understood was precisely not to create the situations which Professor Argentieri mentioned later, to make the whole system collapse. You took out the person you're interested in for whatever reason, but you left the regime there, and you're talking to the regime for an extended transition, probably trying to sweeten the deal with them or something, but it recognizes that disruption can turn into chaos. Greenland is the exact opposite, which is one of the things which make you wonder whether there actually is a overall picture. Attacking a NATO, an ally, whatever alliance, without a clear path, and with, you know, changing rationales. One day it's US security, then you find out you have a treaty, you could do it without all that hullabaloo. The next day is because you want something from Denmark because Norway didn't give you something else, and you're saying, wait a second, you know, and it just doesn't make sense. The only thing which, the only takeaway is, you know, as the Native Americans would have said, you can't trust the white man because you don't know what they're up to. If there is a clearly perceived rationale, you can deal with it. You can make a compromise. You can decide what you're going to give up in order to shore up security, but here it's impossible. And Venezuela and Greenland are clear opposites. So if you want, you can also see, nobody mentioned Iran yet, I think, but Iran is another case where you see, or you can argue, that common sense is prevailing. In other words, avoiding such an important actor and player in regional, country with regional hegemony ambitions from collapsing. Apart from the fact that it's one thing to bomb a specific site, again, an extremely successful operation in technical terms, but how do you bomb morale, which has always been the great problem with air power? How do you bomb something immaterial? What do you think a US intervention in Iran might look like? What do you hit? How are you going to change things? How do you make sure that then the right people come up on top? There is no leverage. So again, it looks like common sense, whether internally developed or, strange enough, heeding the advice of local partners and so on, saying don't do it, it's not a good idea. So again, how do we find an overall explanation, which is what as humans we're always looking for? A simple answer which explains all of our questions. Or are we supposed to resign ourselves to the fact that there isn't, and that goes down to what this administration is, which is a personal regime in which you don't really know from one day to the next what's going to happen. In the first Trump administration, there were, at the time of the first Trump administration, there were many analysts who were trying to project some kind of system onto Trump, trying to say, no, but it makes sense if you assume this and this and this. I think we have all noticed that nobody's trying to do that with the second administration. It's just, it seems to be chaos for the sake of chaos. Doesn't seem, the guys over there at the Higher Defense Studies College hate me because they always tell me to make my annual lecture about the US before the State of the Union address. I think that's unfair because I go there, I go off for an hour, and then 2 weeks later somebody says the contrary, and Professor Lage is an idiot. I think it'd be better if I spoke after the State of the Union and could take into account, but I think that it's pretty clear that there is no sense in what's going on. The US, I usually start with a quote. I usually start with a slide which says, the US only represents 6% of the world population, blah, blah, blah. We should resign ourselves to accept that there cannot be a US solution to every problem, okay? Then I say, remember this one, don't look it up on your phone, and I will ask you at the end of the lecture who said it. It turns out that it was JFK in 1961. The giveaway is 6%. The US is no longer 6% of the world population. But the question is, it was clear back then, the writing was on the wall, and here we have someone who is trying to go back to it. If it was impossible for the US to impose its solution on every world problem back in 1961, it's clearly much more difficult today. I would say well nigh impossible today. The US accounts for about 25% of the world's GDP. China and the EU are 18% each. And until now, the US has basically figured out that by aligning itself 25 plus 18, or in the 43-ish region, you get some people hanging on, you get to 50% and you have a pretty good block. If you start losing a huge block, like the 18%, you're not going to make it up with the 3.8% from Russia. You can think that the idea is that we break up these blocks and fight each country individually. Yes, in theory it works, but only if you're fighting which are tackling, let's say, one problem at a time. Which brings us back to the fact that the clown now has so many balls in the air that you can seriously doubt whether he's going to be able to keep them in the air, or he's going to be able to catch them all, or they're going to escape and fall down. So, I don't know if this makes much sense, but I'm trying to make sense of it. It's really difficult to see a pattern. It's much easier if we look at the US domestically. All the indicators domestically go in the same direction of authoritarianism, period. Period, that's clear. That's clear, and any first-year student can figure it out. There's nothing contradictory on the domestic level. On the international level, it's harder to figure out. It's harder to project how they think they can run the world in 20 years. And I'll add a consideration, and end up, I haven't been keeping time, so I'll cut it here. But the trouble with disruption is that you have to make sure you have time, not just to break things, but to use the pieces to build something new. And because of the domestic front, mostly, this administration knows that it's in trouble already in November, in the midterms. The current majority is, I think, 5 seats in the House, and there's 18 seats which are up for grabs. So, even if you're just doing a 50-50 split, which is more or less, even if you go 52-48, which is more or less how the country's going, you're still going to lose 10 seats, and you're not going to have a majority, and you're going to have a lame duck second half of the presidency. At which point, you've broken the toy, but you don't have the votes to build another one, if not to quite fix it. And so you end up with only the damage. So, at the end, I don't know what's going on. And I hope your questions will help me make sense of this, so that tomorrow morning when I teach at 11, I'll be able to put on a better performance than today. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. You made me think of one aspect that is almost never mentioned: the failed rescue of the hostages in Tehran in May, I reckon, 1980. May 1980. It's not mentioned, but it's something that
Actually, Trump mentioned it in his first press conference. He said,
yes,
we pulled it off, Carter did it.
Carter is an idiot, yes. There was nothing original
But
in that.
on the other hand,
He speaks of it.
if I can just have another joke, if Carter had said that the only law he accepts is your own morality, it would have sounded great. When Trump said it, it sounded ominous.
Yes, very ominous, I agree. So the Argo story, for those who haven't seen the movie, which is kind of pretty good, that lingers over any attempt at changing the course of history in Iran. I think it has affected everybody who might have been involved in an operation. Because when you have a record of a failure in this field, it always weighs more than one thinks. And it's never mentioned. I mean, news are very forgetful. News programs, they only remember what happened like 2 weeks ago, if at all.
I'll add a provocation just because I forget things. They also failed in 1985 at Signorella. If you want to talk about failures.
Yeah, that's another story.
No, but it's a failure. Come in, get the terrorists, pull them out in somebody else's country, and it didn't work. There was no bloodshed, but it didn't work.
Definitely not. Professor Wulzer, your turn.
Yes, thank you, Federico. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. It's not easy to hand this very brilliant round of interventions here. Let me divide my presentation in 3 bullet points. First of all, let me try to explore with you the multidimensional aspect, the multidimensional nature of the Venezuelan crisis, that we can examine from different kind of perspective, global of course, regional of course, and also national. My second point would be I will try to consider this kind of crisis, taking into account some relevant key words for US in the US foreign and security policy tradition, namely regime change and democracy promotion, democracy exploitation, if you prefer. My third point will be I will try to address the theme on what this kind of crisis is telling us about the nature of Trump foreign and security policy, also in the light of the recent national security strategy that has been issued by the administration in the recent time. Maybe Mike is not working properly. Thank you. So first of all, what can we learn by the U.S. intervention in Venezuela from a global perspective? Of course, the first aspect from a global perspective is the U.S. Global competition with China and Russia, as it was mentioned before. The removal of Maduro was the main goal of the removal of Maduro was, of course, the need of removal of a political leader, which represented a kind of antagonistic power of the United States at regional level, but also a leader who was capable to establishing links, connection with US global competitors at a global level, China, a regional level, Russia, and also sub-regional level like Iran, of course. This is very clear. This is a very clear aspect of the U.S. intervention in this crisis, of course. The need to remove a political leader which was strongly connected to the external powers which are competitors of the United States in terms of global competition. But from a global perspective, I would say there are some aspects that worth mentioning here. First of all, this crisis, this US intervention, highlights the notion of the Trump administration regarding the fundamental issues, how to run the war. The idea that the war should be run according to the model of the sphere of influence, the kind of model which ran the global system during the so-called concert of Europe of the 19th century, from the Congress of Vienna to the outbreak of World War I, of course. First of all, the idea of dividing the world into different spheres of influence dominated by the powers, of course. Second, the absolute downsizing of the international law, the replacement of the international law with the notion of the law of the strength of the great powers, of course. And also the third aspect which is emerging from this crisis is the kind of marginalization of the international institution and also of the, broadly speaking, of the multilateralism, of course. What about the regional perspective? The regional perspective of this crisis highlights the fact that, of course, the Trump administration is considering the Western Hemisphere as a kind of United States backyard, as you know, and this idea is also confirming the notion of running the world according to the model of sphere of influences, of course. And from regional perspective, let me make my profession now. I'm a historian of international relations. Are the historical precedents that have been recalled, are they appropriate for framing this kind of crisis? Very partially, I would say. We were mentioning before the Monroe Doctrine. 1823, and the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904, these historical precedents are not totally appropriate, in my view, for a number of reasons. The Monroe Doctrine of 1923 was kind of defensive in its nature. The main goal of the doctrine was to prevent the European colonial powers from gaining space and influence in the region after the dismantle of the Spanish and Portuguese Empire and the establishment of the early Latin American state system. The US intervention in Venezuela as a more assertive stance, of course, is a power projection in Latin America. There is also a defensive rationale in this kind of intervention, of course, the global competition with China and Russia that I was mentioning before, but the Monroe Doctrine historical precedent is not so appropriate for understanding, for framing this kind of US intervention. What about the Roosevelt corollary? The Roosevelt corollary, Federico was mentioning it before, marked a clear shift in the US posture towards Latin America, from a defensive stance to a more active, a more interventionist stance. Of course, from this kind of corollary, from that point onwards, the United States started to adopt the role of a kind of regional policeman in order to protect US commercial, financial interests in Latin America from the domestic unrests. But it is worth mentioning that Theodore Roosevelt was adopting this new line of foreign policy for the benefit of the whole international community. It was maybe the first time in which the United States started to perceive itself and to present itself as a part of a larger international community. In Trump's case, the unilateralism approach prevailed, as we were mentioning before. I think that the most appropriate historical precedent in order to frame the US intervention in Venezuela was the entire period of the Cold War, because during that period, the Latin American foreign policy of the United States was, I would say, twofold. At the same time, the aim of the United States in Latin America was to prevent the communism regime from spreading in the region, and also to extend influence and power on the US, in the southern parts of the Western Hemisphere. As for the national perspective, as you know, the issue at stake here is the strategic relevance of Venezuela. Of course, we have to mention a number of relevant issues, of course, oil resources, drug trafficking, migration flows, but I would add a couple of further motivations from a national perspective, from the perspective of Venezuela's relevance in terms of US interest there. First of all, I was mentioning before, the geopolitical and strategic motivations, the idea of overthrowing Maduro in order to remove the political leader which was strictly aligned to Beijing, to Moscow, and also to Tehran, but also the idea of, I would say, a matter of credibility, the issue of credibility. The United States cannot afford to have a regime that in Latin America which represents a kind of stronghold of Chinese and of China and Russia in the region. What about regime change and democracy promotion? What this kind of crisis is telling us about this pivotal issue in U.S. foreign and security policy? First of all, this aspect has been already mentioned before. At least so far, this is not a complete regime change, of course. Maduro has been removed, has been overthrown, but the idea which is at the moment prevailing in the United States establishment is a kind of removing the leader, but to find out a kind of accommodation with other relevant political figures in the Venezuelan domestic landscape in order to avoid a further engagement of the United States in the transition process of the country. Of course, the Iraqi president of 2003 is particularly instructive from this point of view, of course. So so far this is the main difference between this kind of operation, this kind of intervention, and all the regime change intervention which took place both during the Cold War, Iran 53, Guatemala 54, and after the Cold War, Panama, what it was mentioned before, and also Iraq, and also Libya. Another factor of divergence, of difference between this kind of US intervention and the previous regime change intervention was the issues of democracy. Both during the Cold War and after the Cold War, the US intervention in terms of regime change were rooted of a mix of motivations, I would say, anti-communism and protecting US economic interests during the Cold War. And after the Cold War, the regime change operation started to raise the flag of democracy. It was the case of Panama, the case of Iraq 2003, the case of Libya also. In my perspective, in this case, in the Venezuelan crisis which is taking place now, the issue of democracy has been kind of marginalized. In the prevalent narrative which is accompanying this kind of US intervention, it is always explained in terms of regional security more than in terms of democracy promotion or democracy exploitation. It is worth to underline the fact that the issues of democracy, even when it is used instrumentally in U.S. foreign policy, appears now to be a very, very marginal in the U.S. narrative in terms of foreign policy. So I am concluding now what this kind of U.S. intervention in Venezuela is telling us about the general approach of the second Trump administration in terms of foreign policy. I would say that this kind of intervention, it seems to epitomize several fundamental aspects of this new U.S. administration's foreign policy. First of all, the idea of dividing the world into sphere of influence. And it, of course, this aspect, of course, is raising the questions about the future of Ukraine, of Taiwan, and also about the future of the Iranian regime, of course. Second, the claim of the Western Hemisphere as a geopolitical space under the domination and the control of the United States. So what must we expect now for Greenland now, of course. Third aspect, the irrelevance of the other countries' domestic internal environment when it comes to protecting and defending US interests. The downsizing of the democratic issue in US foreign policy started from the Obama administration, I would say, with there is a clear line of continuity from Obama to Trump 1 to Trump 2 in terms of marginalizing the democratic issues, with the remarkable exception of the Biden administration. Just let me finish remembering that the word democracy is mentioned twice in the recent national security strategy issued by the Trump administration, while it had been mentioned 18 times in the Joe Biden national security strategy. Thanks for your attention.
Wow. We made it in the best tradition of our event. Thank you, Paolo. So the floor is now open for questions and short comments. Make it American and not Italian, because in Italy questions usually last longer than presentations. But no. Please, floor is wide open. Yes, Professor Pagliarucco.
Hi, thank you. Sorry, I'm stuck here in the background and said I'm not very tall, so please forgive me if you only hear my voice. My question is this: I mean, this intervention has been justified on the basis of oil. We're going to get Venezuela's oil. Now, we are in a moment when oil prices are very low. There is an excessive supply of oil. Can we say something about, how much would it cost to actually develop, how many years of investment and how much money would it take to develop the Venezuelan oil industry? Why would any corporation invest so much money in Venezuela today? Can Venezuela be stable enough to be an inviting investment environment for such a long time without any further change? I mean, even if we want to assess Trump's intervention only from this pragmatic point of view, setting aside all the other very important considerations, does it make sense in any way? That's my question. Thank you.
That's for you guys. No, it's better one by one. I prefer one by one if you don't mind. It makes it sharper.
It looks like it's my turn. The oil narrative makes sense and it doesn't. There was a conspicuous lack of enthusiasm when President Trump corralled the oil executives at the White House. As is often the case, the devil is in the details, and the oil there is in horrible places, hard to get, and of a strange quality, so they're not particularly eager to get into it. And if it were a resource grab, one would imagine that maybe we'll talk to the oil industry before getting them the present, which they then apparently are not so eager to receive. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if you look at it another way, in theory, but that's, when you go to those fancy consultancies, like Price Waterhouse, those guys who do PowerPoints rather than analysis, and they just give you billions of barrels of reserves. What happens if you get that up? The prices go down, you're probably hurting your own industry. On the plus side, you're screwing the Russians, which is always good because Russia is, a gas station with nukes. If the price of gas goes down, the Russians are in trouble. But then you're playing footsie with the Russians in Ukraine. So again, too many balls up in the air to find a conclusive explanation. Which is not to say that oil is not good, but it's not particularly clear-cut as to make it the justification. Yes, China buys a lot of oil from Venezuela, so maybe you're trying to hurt the Chinese. Yeah, maybe. I don't know, it doesn't seem to make sense. I think that the changing and shifting narratives are a good indication, The fact that they can't stick to the same story for more than 3 days in a row means something. I have one theory, and I'll stop with this.
They or he?
Right?
They?
Trump and, let's say, his closest advisors. Napoleon used to say, on s'engage et puis on voit. You engage with the enemy and then you see. In other words, where the enemy is soft, is weak, there you concentrate and you go through. So if we take it that way, maybe all of these literally ballon d'essai make sense. He's still trying to find a way which will provide the quickest avenue to a new sphere of influence. And he's trying to see where it works. But you know, clearly doesn't speak French. He probably doesn't know who Napoleon is, and the concept looks way too complex for him. So it may be one of our cases of trying to over-interpret, you know, desperately trying to rationalize something which isn't that rational.
Makes sense. Professor Vilellio, for yes. Yes. If you wait, there is an additional.
I'm not a big oil producer.
Yeah. Wait. Can you wait for another couple of minutes because she has an additional comment?
I wanted to comment on the oil question or sort of extraction more generally, and I think it does speak again to the theory of change because Iraq was back up on levels of oil production only in 2010. Libya is still at 70%. Both of that speaks to the imperative to keep stability. And in fact, that may partly explain why we haven't seen a sort of full regime change. There is, you know, the core of the Venezuelan state is indeed intact. And I'm not sure if this holds, but I think there is something to understand the type of interventionism, which is anyway my concern. But you know, great question, Diego, and I think you know we may not quite know, right? You know how long it's going to take and so on. But I think the perspective is there. The perspective is not only to consolidate the hemispheric security, but also very much to make money out of it. So you know, here of course, and I do think that's. The Trump administration probably understands that. That's, you know, investment and stability goes hand in hand.
Thank you. Professor Vilellio.
Some hypothesis, just to intervene in this debate, isn't it possible that despite the contradiction, the apparent rationality, and the shifting explanation of the behavior of this administration, there is in fact a coherent ideology, coherent vision. And one explanation for the shifting things is that Trump understands very well that in order to occupy the media space the way he does, he has to feed new things to the media. So he could change things. But behind that, there is a coherence, and then really would like to ask you why nobody is mentioned as a model for this foreign policy, the manifest destiny, and the action, President Wilson invasion of Haiti, Nicaragua, Santo Domingo in 1915. Haiti was not paying his debt. Wilson sent the Marines who went straight to the bank, National Bank of Haiti, and got the money. It seems to be sort of like a similarity in this kind of behavior. And I think there is a coherence in this ideological vision that ties the idea of American supremacy based on the racialist idea of America and white and Christian Western people that goes across both its domestic and its international policy.
Mm-hmm. Is this a question or a comment?
It's a comment, and also say why it's okay. It's the Monroe Doctrine, and more defensive than aggressive. But then immediately after the Monroe Doctrine, there is a manifest destiny, and in fact a very aggressive policy and interventionist in the sphere of influence in the Americas.
Actually, the post-corollary American foreign policy, the post-Roosevelt corollary, starts very soon with the Mexican Revolution, that the US supports, but prevent it from sliding too much to the left with energy. So that is not really the Cold War yet, but it's a different type of interventionism that will develop further on in the century.
But manifest destiny is about democracy. I mean, the catchphrase is for our system of federated liberty and federated self-government. And there's neither liberty nor federated self-government. So it's not manifest destiny.
Manifest destiny is behind the invasion of these countries that was mentioned in 1915 or not, or am I completely wrong in my history?
Manifest destiny was
It's
the idea of
1844, it's Texas annexation.
promoting the US model, the US culture, the US way of living abroad, making the US model kind of universal model. It was a very aggressive, I agree with you, but it was a kind of idea of making the US model as a kind of a universal model.
Sort of promotion of democracy.
The same idea was also...
Whatever that meant in the mid-19th century.
I would say that, in my vision, the Trump administration is strongly realistic administration from this point of view. Trump is acknowledging the fact that there are different political models worldwide, and the idea of promoting democracy, or in its distortion view, the idea of exporting democracy, which marked the 2000 under the Bush administration, in my perspective, has completely disappeared. Now there are different kind of political models worldwide. China has its own political model. Russia has its own political model. They have just to coexist, to try to run the world according to the idea of sphere of influence. But the idea of considering the U.S. culture, the U.S. model as the universal one, is not the prevalent idea of the Trump administration.
But that's not what J.D. Vance said in Munich in the spring. He said, our model is best and Europe sucks. He said that very clearly. No, and the national security strategy is full of that. It's imposing, and that's why the 57,000 Greenlanders plus a few white polar bears don't want the US government, because they prefer a European way to an American one.
They prefer sucking Europe. Yes, sir.
Just a quick thought about the oil question. I hesitate to attribute anything as sophisticated as a plan to Donald Trump. I think he's a mean-spirited and impulsive child. But there are behind him people who are capable of formulating a plan. So if you want to evaluate the theory of whether or not oil is the object, bear in mind that the Orinoco oil out of Venezuela is particularly sour, it's particularly sulfur heavy. It is extremely unuseful for the major light distillates such as gasoline. So it doesn't have much to do with the inflation argument or the affordability argument in the United States. If there is a goal, it's because that oil is extraordinarily important to the Chinese construction industry, because its principal three products are bitumen, carbon black, and asphalt. And in fact, of the oil, and since China itself is a large oil producer, but light sulfur, of the oil that China imports, 56% comes from Venezuela and the rest comes from Iran. If they control these two things, it becomes a significant counterweight on the construction industry in China. I don't know whether this is truly the reason or not the reason. That's the relevant context.
Thank you. Yes, young lady over there, Chloe.
So most of you mentioned other times that the U.S. has invaded different countries for different reasons each time. So I'm just wondering what you think, when you think it's appropriate and necessary for the U.S. to get involved with foreign powers, particularly if you think it was appropriate for the U.S. to step in Venezuela, and just what sort of power over other countries do you think the U.S. should even have? Should they even get involved?
Well, I'll answer this one. Thank you for asking. It's a very important issue that you raise here. I would have a sort of oblique answer to this. If U.S. intervention creates hope and enthusiasm among the populace, then there's something good to it. If it makes people desperate, then no. You see what I mean? I mean, US interventions have not always been in favor of democracy to remove dictators. They have been pretty much the other way as well. Paolo has remembered Iran's troubles begin not in 1979 but in 1953, which is when a democratic moderate government elected by the people was removed because of suspicions that it might be too leftist. Forcibly removed by a coup d'etat. That's when Iran's troubles began, and they haven't ended almost 73 years later. You see? There's also the case of Pinochet in Chile in 1973. There was a democratic government, sliding pretty much to the left, but respectful of the constitution, that may have been defeated at the following election, but there was much impatience, and the US staged a coup d'etat against the Allende government, a military coup that threw millions of Chileans into desperation and forced them to go into exile and abandon the country in some cases forever. You see? So Iraq, that I mentioned, was on the good side. People were happy that Saddam Hussein was removed because he had turned into an implacable tyrant. They were not happy of what came next, the experiment in forcibly building a democracy in Iraq. Same thing with Afghanistan. So the mood changes. In Afghanistan, when the NATO troops intervened in October 2001, following the Twin Towers, people were pretty much fed up with the Taliban government, and they welcomed the Western intervention that lasted for exactly 20 years. And unfortunately, having failed to build, or left because it thought that Afghanistan had become capable of holding to the democratic principles, but this was an illusion. So you judge these things based on international law, they are all wrong. International law says no interference in domestic affairs. It's the UN Charter. But from the practical, pragmatic point of view, it depends on what the populace feels about it, in my age. Okay. Next round, Professor Dr. Fanti. No, not the professor.
Very simple. I agree that perhaps we are over-analyzing, as you say, over justifying his behavior, but there's an elephant in the room, I think, it's an existential threat for him that at a personal level that he's obsessed by it, by all accounts, which is the infamous Epstein files, which we didn't talk about. But I think the Senate unanimously voted to release it, and he's not, and he's trying to keep the issue off the agenda, so he's doing all kind of crazy things. And internationally, perhaps there is a grifting problem, that he wants to get billions. He's selling Venezuela oil, as bad as it is, and he sends the money to a Qatar account. Isn't it unheard of, you know? In Gaza, he wants to do real estate development for himself. He's creating a United Nations Security Council private of 1 billion token fee, and Lukashenko says, okay, I join, and come on. Let's not do so complicated, you know, intellectual analysis. This is grifting down to earth. So if somebody can stop him, good. If not, that's what we are living with.
Yes.
What do you think? My question is, what do you think?
Not a happy birthday for the US, 250, most predictably.
Well, let's just say it, you know. Until recently, that was a conspiracy theory. No, now it's written on the wall. Sorry. Okay. Thank you.
Definitely. A student, or another student, after Chloe. come on. Be brave. I'm sure you have ideas and curiosity.
So I honestly don't know that much about this topic. I'm just here to learn a little bit. But my question is, what is the relationship between Trump and Rodriguez? So does it seem like Trump is committed to helping Rodriguez get into power? Is he even in a position to do that? Does it seem likely that Rodriguez would be in a position of power?
That's a very good question. I'd say the following. The comparison I did at the very beginning with Italy in the Second World War makes sense if you consider what you said, that the intervention didn't change, the intervention against Maduro didn't change the political structure of Venezuela. Political structure of Venezuela is as it was, just as fascist Italy was some sort of fascism without Mussolini after the arrest of Mussolini, okay? And Delcy Rodriguez is certainly a Maduro supporter, was one that is trying to take advantage of the situation. But there is there aren't many illusions to be made about where she stands. She, for example, delivered certain political prisoners to have a great international echo. For example, there were some Italians who had been there, some 100% Italians, because there's also the Italian Venezuelans, the Venezuelan Italians, which are another category of people. But those who had only the Italian passport were delivered. And this bounced back very positively, but it doesn't mean that Rodriguez is the person that can lead Venezuela to a return of democracy. So it's very unpredictable in this respect, but for one who doesn't know things, your question was very appropriate. Couple more?
I have one more question. So I don't think any of you mentioned this, but you might remember that I think just about a week before the Venezuelan president was captured, the U.S. struck down several boats that they thought were Venezuelan drug boats. And so I'm just wondering if you think that that is related to this at all, or the validity of that accusation, or just how you think these, or even if they are related.
Interesting question. It's certainly related in terms of dubious legality in terms of international law. But what I think is even more interesting is that Trump has had an obsession with Venezuela going way back. When he lost the 2020 election, one of the harebrained arguments about the rigged election was that the Venezuelans owned the Canadian company which makes the voting machines and had switched the votes in the night. Now, allowing for the fact that somebody might have done it, it's so harebrained that it went through an Italian server in Chieti, owned by Leonardo. It's just, I mean, you know, I can't make up stuff like this. It's just, I don't have enough imagination to make it up. But the point is, why Venezuela and not any other country? What was the connection with it? You want to say drugs, fine, but what's the link with drugs and the rigged election? I think that a lot of the stuff is part of the building up, preparing people for what's going to come. In other words, you start seeding the ground until it's something everybody knows back there. It's, you may remember, there's this American advertising executive, his name is Durstein, but I could be wrong, and he said, don't bother me with the facts, I've already made up my mind. That's what advertising is about. You go to the supermarket and you're not looking for the best product one you already know. And in this sense, this approach of bringing up Venezuela time and time again is simply to make it feel natural when you eventually attack it. Drugs don't cut it. Venezuela is not the largest provider. The fentanyl comes from China and other places. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. So the shooting of the boats doesn't really make sense unless it's just a raw display of power. I can do it, therefore I do it. I can get away with it, therefore I do it. I mean, it's just, if you read the Constitution, which Trump obviously hasn't, you know, you look at what it says about criminal trials, clearly that standard is not met when you're shooting those boats without any kind of evidence or anything like that. So I'm more in the propaganda mood, and just preparing people for what's going to come. Getting people used to the fact that Venezuelans are bad, are evil, okay? Rather than any factual base. And sorry for going on so long.
Yes, it was of course a display of military force of the United States in front of Venezuela, but it was maybe also the idea of proposing a kind of exit strategy to Maduro before the military intervention. This can be also a interesting interpretation in order to frame the last step of the United States towards Venezuela before the intervention for capturing Maduro.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Professor Scarpa speaking. I see that some of the students have had questions related to international law, and since my background is in international law, then I feel that perhaps it's necessary to make some clarifications in this respect. I'm sorry that I was late, so I don't know if this was covered at the very beginning of this meeting. But anyhow, if you look at the system that was developed after the end of the Second World War, in the Charter of the United Nations, we find a fundamental provision, which is Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the UN Charter. And that provision says that it's illegal to use force, the threat to use of force in international relations against both the territorial integrity or also the political independence of other states is prohibited. So somehow sending soldiers abroad on the territory of another country, if you're not invited, if it's not the political leaders of that other country invited you to send the soldiers then eventually that is illegal in itself. This case is special because, as it was stated, it's some kind of an issue that we call regime change. And we have had slightly less than 30 cases, since the end of the Second World War. In those 30 cases, then eventually what happened doesn't lead actually to the specifics of a rule under international law. What it means is that the practice that we see goes in 4 different directions. The majority of cases, what we see is that the Security Council of the UN, which is the body that should be mandated to intervene whenever we have a situation, which is a crisis in the area of peace and security, should intervene. Usually the countries that are within the Security Council always have staff present in New York so that they can meet also at night, whenever this is necessary, also for eventual meetings, in situations of urgency. The issue is that whenever those issues have to do with one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, so the US, China, Russia, UK, or France, eventually, as you know, these countries not only have permanent members, but they also have a veto power. So eventually it's difficult for the Council itself. At times, some resolutions, draft resolutions were tabled, but they were never adopted because of the veto, the use of the veto, or threatening, let's say, the use of the veto by one of the permanent 5. Many of the cases that we have seen actually pertain to the US, and a few also to Russia or Soviet Union before. The Afghani case that you mentioned before, Professor Argentieri, actually that is a special case because there was a resolution of the Security Council that approved the intervention of the US because of the Al-Qaeda attacks to the Twin Towers
of NATO, not the US only.
yes, NATO, fine, but that was somehow considered legal under international law because it's so, the covering up of a resolution by the Security Council. Other cases could be considered illegal whenever actually there's no resolution being approved. This case is kind of special because somehow we see that there's no full regime change in a way. It seems that only Maduro somehow was arrested and taken abroad, while the rest of the elite in the country somehow seems to stay. But still it is true that the soldiers were sent in, and so eventually some kind of a violation of that rule stays. There's jurisprudence in that respect. The International Court of Justice, which is the main organ of the UN, trying to solve disputes between states, in 1979, when the United Nations somehow intervened, aside with the Contras in Nicaragua, so another country in America, then eventually the court said, given that Nicaragua somehow said, we want to raise this issue against the US, to say that somehow the fundamental rule, Article 2, Paragraph 4, in essence was violated. The court actually in that case, first of all, raised an issue, said this rule not only is a treaty rule, not only is a rule that applies among states that ratified the UN Charter, but it's a rule that has customary nature, it applies to everybody. And then eventually this rule developed into a peremptory norm of international law, which means it's mandatory for everybody. And it's superior at the level of rules in respect of other rules. Eventually then what they said is also something else. They said, and the US actually never appeared. So Nicaragua appeared in front of the court, the US never appeared in front of the court. They refused actually the jurisdiction of the court. What the court also stated is that eventually the rule stays. So we are glad actually in my view to say that the rule can stay even if we see violations whenever states, and this always happens, somehow try to justify themselves by not saying that they are violating the rule, but by putting other justifications. So as far as they say that they do things for other reasons, and not eventually the invasion or aggression against another country, we should be kind of safe to say that the rule stays. But eventually we can, be worried that the more the rule is violated, the more also the fact that the states use other justifications might one day or the other be, fading away. Thanks.
Thank you. One last question. So we are just about to be kicked out of the building, so we should wrap up after almost 2 full hours. One last question. Ultima. Nobody? Okay, we've had enough.
Can I quote Shakespeare?
Yes.
No event is complete without quoting Shakespeare, okay? And Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2, I think it's line 222, 223, Polonius. Though this be madness, there is a method in it. Now, the question is...
Very often quoted.
Yes, the question is, do we put a question mark at the end of it?
No.
Do we take it as stated, or do we wonder whether there is a method?
We did put a question mark at the end of the title of this panel, but not at the end of Polonius' statement. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, that's